What if I told you that stupidity, not evil, is the greatest threat to humanity? Evil knows what it's doing. Evil wears a face. It can be judged, resisted, even shamed. But stupidity walks right into your life smiling, certain, unshakable. You can't argue with it because it doesn't think, it reacts. It doesn't question, it echoes. It isn't curious. It's absolutely convinced it's right. That's what makes it dangerous. Not just frustrating, not just annoying. A threat to truth, a threat to freedom, a threat to humanity. You can negotiate with malice, you can expose hypocrisy, you can even reform cruelty. But stupidity, it builds a wall between itself and reality, and it thinks that wall is a window. Think about the last time you tried to explain something rational to someone deeply convinced of something false. Maybe they mocked you, laughed, dismissed it with whatever, or that's just your opinion. That wasn't debate, that was denial dressed as confidence. And here's the twist. Stupidity isn't about a low IQ. Some of the smartest people on paper have been staggeringly stupid in their actions. Because real stupidity, the kind we're talking about, isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a surrender, a refusal, a choice to not think. The German theologian and psychologist Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw this up close, living through the rise of the Nazi regime. He watched academics, artists, doctors, people with education, culture, and status turn into instruments of violence and hatred. And they weren't evil masterminds. They were obedient, blind, stupid. Bonhoeffer didn't just write this off as politics. He called it out for what it was, a moral failure of the mind, a collapse not in intellect, but in courage. He argued that evil often carries the weight of guilt. You can reach it with appeal. But stupidity? Stupidity is immune to guilt, immune to logic. It does not feel wrong because it has stopped feeling anything at all except self-righteousness. And that's what makes it so horrifying. It's confident. The stupid person doesn't think they're wrong. They think they're saving the world. And that's where things get chilling. You can't wake someone who refuses to be conscious. We've seen this throughout history, entire societies collapsing into cruelty, not because they were overtaken by evil men, but because ordinary people stopped thinking for themselves. They parroted slogans, they followed crowds, they repeated the lie until the lie felt like truth. So ask yourself, have you ever seen someone become less curious the more convinced they became? Someone who clung harder to an idea every time it was challenged? That's not strength. That's intellectual decay. That's the kind of stupidity that ends democracies, silences dissent, rewrites facts, and calls it righteousness. The worst part? It doesn't show up in dramatic ways at first. It looks like comfort. It sounds like common sense. It spreads like small talk. Someone hears a lie often enough, and instead of thinking, they just nod. And then they vote, and then they teach, and then they raise children. And suddenly, generations are infected with beliefs no one ever really examined. Bonhoeffer watched this happen to a nation known for its poetry, philosophy, music, and science. He watched it fall into darkness, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it lacked the will to question. And that's the key. Stupidity is not a glitch. It's a system. It is designed, cultivated, and rewarded in environments where obedience is more valuable than insight. We think we're safe from it. But look around. People don't always lose their ability to think. They hand it over. They stop reading things that challenge them. They silence people who disagree. They mock complexity as elitism. They praise simplicity, even when it's based on lies. And once you've surrendered your mind, you can be convinced to do anything. You can support destruction and call it patriotism. You can attack truth and call it loyalty. You can oppress others and call it justice. That's why stupidity is not just an individual weakness. It's a social virus, and it mutates. It moves through schools, media, politics, and families. It gets passed down like tradition until suddenly people are willing to do unthinkable things, not because they're evil, but because they're sure they're good. And the scary part? They'll never know they were wrong. That's why you can't fight stupidity with facts alone. It's not a debate, it's a delusion. Bonhoeffer said, "You don't argue someone out of stupidity, you have to free them." But what does that look like? Here's part 2 of your powerful, psychology-focused video script. This section dives deeper into the psychology and social mechanics of stupidity as Bonhoeffer saw it, unpacking how it spreads, why it thrives, and what makes it so insidious. Stupidity isn't born, it's built. You're not stupid because you lack intelligence. You become stupid the moment you give up the responsibility to think. When you silence your inner voice to fit in, to belong, or simply to avoid discomfort. Bonhoeffer didn't call stupidity a genetic flaw. He called it a moral failure of the collective mind, a decision to stop engaging with truth, a willingness to substitute your own judgment for whatever the group says is acceptable. And here's the twist most people don't see coming. Stupidity thrives in groups. The more people around you echo a belief, the more legitimate it feels. The dumber the idea, the louder the applause, if that idea makes people feel safe or superior. That's how groupthink works. We don't want to challenge others because it risks exclusion. So instead, we swallow doubt. We laugh along. We share posts we haven't read. We nod, smile, repeat, until we're no longer thinking, we're just transmitting. And that's what makes stupidity contagious. It doesn't need a logical foundation. It doesn't need data. It just needs a little shame, a little fear, and a powerful enough voice saying, "This is the truth." And suddenly, smart people say stupid things with complete conviction. This is how it happens in authoritarian regimes, but also in classrooms, in offices, online communities, political rallies, even family dinners. Someone with authority says something absurd, and instead of calling it out, people look around, hesitate, then agree. Not because they believe it, but because they're afraid of the cost of disagreeing, and that's how the infection spreads. Bonhoeffer saw this under Hitler. He saw how German citizens, many of them kind, thoughtful, even devout, surrendered their discernment in exchange for belonging. Not because they were evil, but because it was easier to conform than to question. This is why Bonhoeffer didn't define stupidity as a lack of mental capacity. He defined it as a refusal to think morally under pressure. Let that sink in. You can be brilliant on paper, you can quote philosophers, you can ace exams, and still fall prey to stupidity if your intellect serves only your ego and not your conscience. Because real intelligence, wise intelligence, demands discomfort. It questions its own beliefs. It slows down. It checks for blind spots. It knows that being certain doesn't make you right. But stupid people, they don't slow down. They accelerate. And when you challenge them, they don't reflect. They dig in deeper. You've seen it, maybe even recently. You point out the inconsistency. They roll their eyes, they change the subject. They accuse you of overthinking, or worse, they act like you're the stupid one for asking questions. That's not debate. That's intellectual cowardice wrapped in arrogance. And it's everywhere. It's in, "Just trust the system." It's in, "You're either with us or against us." It's in every oversimplified slogan that sounds good and means nothing. And the moment you surrender your curiosity for the sake of convenience, you're not just uninformed, you're enslaved. That's why Bonhoeffer believes stupidity must be resisted, not with more information, but with moral clarity. Because here's the problem no one wants to admit. You can't think critically while trying to belong blindly. Most people aren't trained to think for themselves. They're trained to follow rules, pass tests, get approval, stay in line. And the smarter they are in these systems, the better they get at obedience, not insight. They become experts at playing the role, not questioning the script. That's what happened in Nazi Germany, and it happens now. Don't think it's over. Don't think it's past. Stupidity doesn't retire. It reinvents. It shows up with new labels. It updates its slogans. It targets your fears. It flatters your ego. It simplifies your pain and says, "Here's who to blame." And if you're not paying attention, you'll believe it. Because the stupid mind doesn't crave truth. It craves certainty. The comfort of being right is more seductive than the effort of being accurate. So ask yourself, where do I outsource my thinking? Who tells me what's true? And when did I stop checking? If you can't answer, that's your edge. That's the exact spot where your mind is most vulnerable to manipulation. And let's be clear, stupidity isn't just passive. It becomes dangerous when weaponized. When those in power understand that mass stupidity is useful, they start to shape their messages accordingly. They stop trying to educate and start trying to control. They don't need to convince everyone, just enough people to stop asking questions. And once enough minds are asleep, the rest fall silent, or worse, complicit. That's when you see the rise of systems that feed off ignorance. Propaganda becomes policy, complexity becomes criminalized, and truth becomes dangerous. And all of it begins with one small internal shift. The moment a person says, "I'd rather be accepted than be honest." That's how societies crumble from the inside out. Not through violence at first, but through intellectual decay. So how do we fight it? So how do we resist stupidity, not just in others, but in ourselves? How do we stay awake in a world that keeps rewarding blind belief, echo chambers, and oversimplified slogans? Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity isn't cured by instruction. It's cured by liberation, and that starts from within. The first step is deceptively simple. Never outsource your thinking, not to a politician, not to a preacher, not to a teacher, influencer, algorithm, or crowd. Listen, learn, absorb, but never obey without examination. Truth does not fear scrutiny, authority does. So if you find yourself surrounded by people who discourage questions, who roll their eyes at nuance, who punish dissent, leave. That is not a community. That is a cult. Second, stop confusing intelligence with wisdom. Smart people are not immune to stupidity. In fact, they're often the most skilled at justifying it. They use big words to say small things. They build arguments not to seek truth, but to protect their ego. Wisdom is different. Wisdom listens more than it speaks. It asks, "What am I missing?" It admits, "I could be wrong." And most importantly, it doesn't perform. It thinks. Third, develop emotional resilience. Why? Because the temptation to surrender your mind often comes from discomfort. Discomfort with being the only one questioning. Discomfort with being called difficult, rebellious, or extreme. Discomfort with uncertainty. Stupid ideas don't win because they're convincing. They win because people don't want to be alone in disagreeing with them. But here's the truth. Loneliness is safer than blindness. Standing apart might be painful, but standing in line for something you know is wrong? That's the slow death of the soul. So build a mind that can hold tension, one that can say, "I don't have the answer yet, but I'm not going to lie just to feel safe." That's how inner freedom is forged. Fourth, look for complexity, not comfort. Stupidity loves black and white. Wisdom knows life is grayscale. If someone says, "This one group is to blame," they're lying. If someone says, "This idea is beyond question," they're selling control. If someone demands loyalty over honesty, you're in the presence of manipulation. Truth is messy. Freedom is uncomfortable. And clarity, real clarity, usually comes with friction, not applause. And lastly, keep your mind moving. Stupidity thrives in stillness, not the good kind, the apathetic kind, where you stop reading, stop learning, stop questioning. You settle into what feels right and assume it must be right. But truth isn't static. And the moment you stop evolving, your mind becomes a perfect host for propaganda. So read things you disagree with. Talk to people who challenge you. Notice your triggers. Follow your discomfort. And never confuse certainty with clarity. Because the people who are most dangerous to society aren't just the ones shouting nonsense. They're the ones who stop listening altogether. You must not become one of them. We need minds that think deeply, not just react quickly. We need people who are more committed to truth than to belonging. We need courage, not the kind that fights others, but the kind that refuses to lie to itself. Because here's what no one tells you. The real battlefield isn't outside. It's your own attention, your beliefs, your ability to pause before you parrot. The war isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a quiet dinner where you don't speak up. Sometimes it looks like silence in the face of a lie. Sometimes it's you scrolling past something that should have made you think. And that's how stupidity wins. Not by force, but by fatigue, by your willingness to check out and say, whatever. It doesn't matter. But it does. It matters more than ever. Because right now in this moment, someone is trying to shape what you believe. Not for your benefit, but for their gain. They're selling narratives, building movements, influencing systems, and they're counting on your disengagement. The antidote: stay critical, stay curious, stay awake. You don't need to be perfect, just present. You don't need to know everything, just be willing to learn. You don't need to fight every battle, just don't abandon the ones that matter. And above all, do not trade your mind for membership, because the price is too high. So if this message hit somewhere deep, if it echoed something you felt but never had the words for, then it's your turn, not to repeat it, but to live it. Start small. Start with your next conversation. Start with the next post you don't automatically agree with. Start by noticing where you're numb, where you've stopped asking why. That's where the shift begins. And if this video gave you clarity, gave you questions, or just gave you the sense that you're not crazy for feeling like the world is losing its mind, subscribe.